Good afternoon, everybody. It's my duty to keep you awake for the next 1 hour, and I hope to be able to do that. A little bit about myself, but before I come to myself, I would like to thank the organizers of this conference for inviting me. This is my first international conference on aging and spirituality, and it's given me an opportunity to see Canberra, your capital, which is a lovely city. And I attended the very beautiful ceremony at the reception to thank the leaders of the land. And I would also like to pay my respects to the First Nation people and the people of the land and the leaders, past, present, and emerging. Thank you so much for making that beginning so meaningful. It really touched the spirit, which is what we are going to speak about in this conference. I am from Singapore. By ethnicity, I am Indian. I am fourth generation Indian descendant. My great-grandfather came from India, northwest India, near Mumbai. Perhaps some of you are familiar with Mumbai. And so I'm very much Singaporean. And I would like to say that my background is in social work. I know many of you social workers are attending this conference. And in addition to that, I decided to specialize in gerontology. So my journey and fascination with the aging process started with my mother. My mother was a community worker in our small, one of the sub-ethnic groups called Gujaratis. And she would be ever ready to run out to help anyone who came to our home and said, "Can you please come? My child does not stop crying," or "My daughter-in-law is having pains. Should I take her to the hospital?" And there she would tell us, "I'll be back," and she'll go off. And so that's where my social work beginnings started. And as I got married and then joined my husband's family, because in our Indian custom, it's patriarchal system, so usually the bride will move into the husband's family and is expected to treat the husband's parents as her own parents. And so I was with my husband's parents for more than 35 years. And this is where I started my interest in aging, because I watched them from being very independent, very active, third agers, and then move into the fourth age. And I was thinking, I will be there one day. I would like to know more. What happens to people? And not just their emotions, but also their thoughts, and also their preparation for death and afterlife. So the title of the presentation is The Universality of Spiritual Pursuits. Why universality? Because having heard everyone yesterday and today, something within me tells me that it is a universal process. Why would more than 150 people be sitting here and listening to this subject on spirituality and aging if it was not important? Not important maybe to them right now if they are still in their 30s or 40s, but maybe to their parents. So I believe that no matter what part of the world you live in, whatever ethnic group, religious group you belong to, as we age is a leveler. We all start thinking of similar concerns, and we have similar bodily changes. We face concerns like financial concerns, who will take care of me? And these things prompt us to go within ourselves, to start seeking within ourselves the answers. And this is why it is a universal process from my point of view. And I also look at spiritual pursuits rather than activities or rituals or beliefs. I think pursuits is a much broader word that allows us to do things our own way, whether it is next to the sea and you are so near to nature and you feel uplifted, whether it's your spirit or your soul that gets uplifted, something within you gets uplifted. So I think this is where I'd like to begin this short journey with all of you. I'm going to talk about narrative, the spiritual narrative, how it is related to aging, how it is universal. It is at the same time very personal. And why is this discourse important? So I will go through all this one by one. And I would start by saying that I resonate with the people who earlier mentioned that as we age, we move from doing and becoming to being. And maybe that's why we are called human beings. Whoever coined the term human being got it right. Don't you agree? Yeah? So it's about being yourself and being able to relate to others in your own way. There's another simple phrase that we often hear, know thyself. This also resonates across different religions. Maybe it's expressed a little bit differently, but basically our religions and our spiritual journeys teach us to know yourself. And what does that mean? I think it is a spiritual search that all of us begin at some point in our life. It could be even in youth. I know some youth, because of a friend's sudden death or something, and they start asking these existential questions. So it does not necessarily have to start when we are 50 or 60. It could start much earlier. In my teaching experience, during the discussions with students on death and dying, I do have students who break down, they cry because they remember a fond memory of a grandmother who passed away, and they have some very strong attachment towards her. And this starts that journey of asking, what is my purpose on this life? In the current state of the world, I think it is even more imperative, due to global aging, to understand the link between spirituality, religion, and aging. So what does research show us? Well, we have so many different eminent scholars like Frankl, Lao Tzu, Jung, Raker, and Wong, who have started writing a lot about this topic of meaning of life. And each one has added something new in that scholarly discussion. I will not go into all of them because many of them have been mentioned earlier by speakers, but I will make special mention of the Will to Meaning by Frankl, because perhaps he was one of the earliest to start us on this thought process of why is meaning of life so important to human beings? And as we age, it becomes even more important. Perhaps it's because of the urgency of death. And I've written on this topic. If you do a Google search, you will find my name in the Google Scholar. I think the very fact that we are getting nearer and nearer towards the end, whatever age the end may be, 100, 120, or as mentioned earlier this morning, 150, whatever that number is, that's not important. The important thing is our body starts to tell us that I'm not that young anymore. I can't run as fast anymore, or I get breathless when I climb 200 steps or something like that. That's the first signal, isn't it? And then sometimes we start forgetting things, not in a negative way, but just because of stress or maybe lack of sleep. We naturally start, functioning in a slightly different way. But most of us are very patient with ourselves. And we give lots of excuses for ourselves. But the truth is, somebody at 50 cannot be functioning in the same way as 20 or 30. And that's the truth. And we just accept it as life's journey, right? And this is one of the things I learned from my PhD research. I made a comparison of Indians, Chinese, and Malays. These are the three major ethnic groups in Singapore. Myself being Indian, I wanted to know the answer to one question. And that's how the PhD journey began. What is the reason for the same age group doing different things at the same time of the day? So if you tell yourself at 6 o'clock in the morning, what would a Chinese be doing, a Malay be doing, and an Indian be doing? Because it reflects their value system and their beliefs. So typically, a Chinese person would be doing Tai Chi or Qigong. In the morning, they're all out there, exercising away, keeping their body fit. What would an Indian be doing? Probably meditation, because that is in our DNA, the whole practice of meditation. I remember my mom would wake up at 4:30 and she'll be chanting and so on. And what would be the Malay person's activity? Usually at 5 or 5:30, it's prayer time, isn't it? So they would be praying. So different activities, same time of the day by different ethnic groups. What is the reason? I wanted to find out what is the basis of that belief system. And so my journey began in comparing these three cultures. And I think I learned a lot through that journey. I also learned about the fact that older people, because my sample was people 70 years and above, they think a lot about their afterlife. What happens after death? And I think many of you in this room would be also thinking about that at some point in time or another. And the answers are different according to our religious beliefs. For Hindus, it is the idea of reincarnation and the cycle of birth and rebirth. And for the other religions, maybe slightly different. But the thought process is the same. What happens after death? And because of the urgency of death, because of the need to find answers to what happens after death, and the existential questions we have in our minds, I think many of us are preoccupied with those questions. But as researchers, we wonder, should I talk about death to an older person? Will the person be uncomfortable? But my experience was they're not uncomfortable. It is us, professionals, who need to be comfortable. Once we are comfortable, they are more than willing to share, because actually they're waiting for somebody to ask such a question so that they can talk about it freely. What's occupying them in the mind as they sit and gaze outside the window, or the last thing before they go to sleep. So really we are there to listen and maybe to ask the right questions so that they can share. So this is what I found through my PhD journey, and then the many, many years of research that I've been doing after that. So in terms of the columns there, under disciplines, I have put 3 disciplines that come to my mind when we talk about spirituality and aging. Theology, which was mentioned by earlier speakers. To me, and correct me if I'm wrong, under the Asian cultural context, it would be more culture-specific in the sense that the religion has a very strong relationship to the cultural context, whether it's Thailand or whether it's India or Philippines. In the non-Asian context, largely it is Christian scriptures and a lot of scholarly literature that has been written on this. Under gerontology, being a pretty young discipline, only about 100 years old, so it tends to be more in the academic sphere, but more and more it is being mainstreamed. And I hope we will continue to mainstream gerontology in our primary school, in our secondary schools, and even in universities, to talk about aging and talk about the aging process as if it were part of life's journey, rather than putting it as only after retirement we think about aging, not before that. But really we need to talk about it to even young people. Thanatology, related to death, tends to be religion-focused in the Asian context, and a large part of it is to do with science focus in the non-Asian context. And we did talk about the medicalization of geriatrics earlier. Now I'm trying to bring you slowly into the realm of the kind of religions that I'm more familiar with, and I hope you will also come along with me, and if you have questions, please feel free to ask at the end, because I will not be able to talk in great depth. It would take many days if we were to discuss about Hinduism and then Buddhism and so on. So just a little taste of what Hindu religion is about, because I'm a Hindu myself. We have the concept of dharma. Even in Buddhism, they have the concept of dharma. And dharma refers to the idea of classification of phases in a person's life. So we have the student phase, you have the adult, middle age, old age, 4 main phases. And according to Hindu literature, each phase has its own roles and responsibilities. So for the student is supposed to study and work hard so that when he becomes an adult, he will be able to be responsible for a family and get a good job and so on. For adults, is to work, set up a family, and carry out their responsibilities towards parents. And then comes middle age, what we call the third age. In the middle age, the person is supposed to look after his family with diligence, support the family, wife and husband together, and also contribute to society. And lastly, in old age, Hindus believe that as we get to the 70s and 80s, we need to slowly detach from material attachments and turn our mind towards spirituality and religion. So this is a kind of a cultural script that Hindus are taught when they are young. I call it a cultural script because it's not like mandatory. It's your choice whether you want to follow it or not, but it is considered like a framework that is good for people to follow. And aging, and when we talk about seniors and old age and the fourth age, really the universality of spiritual pursuits comes into this picture here at the fourth age of the Hindu cultural script. The second concept I want to talk about is Advaita, A-D-V-A-I-T-A. Advaita, some of you may know it as non-duality. Non-duality refers to the idea that you and I are not separate, we are one. God and I are not separate, we are one. We are connected, and we are part of the whole universe, the whole cosmos. So from this idea that we come from the universe and we go back into the universe, whatever we do affects everyone else around us because we are one. And so coming from this oneness perspective, or what we call non-duality, we are not two, we are one. Coming from this perspective, Hinduism tries to portray that all human beings are all one. We may follow different religions, but at the end of the day, we are one. And whatever we do affects the other person. And to me, this concept is really, really important if we want to create a more peaceful world. Then I'll move on to Buddhism. Buddhism, as you know, also started in India. And I'll just mention the Sati tradition, which started a long, long time ago. And the Sati tradition promoted the idea of meditation and mindfulness. And I have certain references where the authors advocate that mindfulness really started long, long time back in Buddhist tradition, where the Buddha himself encouraged being inward-looking and in the present. So this idea of being in the present has its roots in Buddhist tradition as far as some of the scholars are concerned. We are now looking at how mindfulness is spreading very, very fast, isn't it? Young children in schools are taught mindfulness, adults to reduce their work stress. Elderly, I was attending the workshop yesterday, how mindfulness is taught in nursing homes and so on. So it's a technique, but actually it has a long tradition in spirituality. And that's what's important. If we lose that spiritual aspect, I think we lose a lot. Just like yoga, if you practice it as a kind of a health technique, you're losing something because yoga is actually the alignment of body, mind, and spirit. When all three are aligned, you get the biggest benefit to your mind and your body. So we must remember the values that underlie mindfulness and underlie yoga. Now, Rupert Spira, the third point there, I have started following him lately. He's a Britisher who went to India and started studying some of the Hindu literature as well as Hindu saints. And he has made their teaching so simple, so easy to understand, and so applicable today. So you can just Google under YouTube, Rupert Spira, S-P-I-R-A, and you'll see many YouTubes there, which put in like 10-minute YouTube videos the concept of Advaita, the concept of knowing thyself, the concept of Hindu beliefs like, for example, karma, reincarnation. So I leave it to you. If you're interested, you can look at this source, because some of the Hindu literature, even though it's translated in English, can be pretty heavy-going. I find it heavy-going myself. So that is why I recommend something a little bit of an alternative. So you have mindfulness, you have spirituality, and you have religious involvement. All three are actually all linked together. And that's why I've put it in this form. Recently, I came across this author, Marone, who stated that it is perhaps the process rather than the specific religious belief that matters. And in an international group like this, I think this is a very important point we all need to bear, that whether it's Christianity, whether it's Islam, whether it's Hinduism, whether it's Buddhism, whether it's Jainism, Sikhism, really it's the process from where we are to where we are getting at. That is more important than the religion itself. If we can understand that, then actually we can understand transformation, we can understand mindfulness, because it is that same process that human beings go through of searching within yourself for an answer to your question, right? Other techniques that are being used today, like spiritual reminiscence, spiritual care for the dying, faith development in the adult life course, spiritual development across the human lifespan, they all point towards self-discovery and entry into the divine sphere. So to me, it is a very humanitarian, human endeavor that we start to discover within ourselves. Hindus believe that the human being is essentially divine. It is a divine soul living within a material body. Rather than what we usually say, who are you? So we say, I am so-and-so, and we tend to identify ourselves with our body. But actually, in the Hindu belief system, it is essentially the divine, it is essentially the soul within you that is the I that we all are looking for. And every individual can attain knowledge of this truth because it is a process. A human being is not the body, mind, or intellect. In fact, he or she is beyond these, and by disidentifying with them, he or she will reach the essential source and be liberated. So, although we say we consist of body, mind, and spirit, actually we are capable of something beyond all this, and then it takes us into the divine sphere. So a couple of concepts. I mentioned Dharma just now. At the individual level, it is the law of right living at each stage of your life. And its observance fulfills two objectives: happiness in life and liberation from all bondage. Advaita is non-duality. All human experience is a merging of I and other into one. It is an illusion that the perceiver and the perceived object are separate. I know what I'm saying is very deep. It took me a long time to get to that point to understand that the perceiver and the perceived are one. Until one night when I was about to sleep. And then something happened, like a I don't know what to call it, like a sudden awakening, like I could see myself. And I was like, I'm here lying on the bed, but I can see myself. So it was like me and the perceived object and the perceiver became one. And then I got the idea that, oh yeah, actually you need to experience it to know it. So some of you may have had that experience at some point, I'm not sure. But try it. It's a lot of fun, It's a lot of fun, actually. Movies like, for example, they talk about somebody had an accident and then the soul came out and then looked at the body, those kind of movies. And it's like, wow, how do you do that? But actually the soul went out, and then we say in Hindu tradition, actually the time was not complete for that soul to leave the body. And that is why the soul came back to complete the journey that he was destined to complete. But it's a lot of fun, actually. Spirituality and all these experiences, to me, if we enjoy it, then we want to know more, right? It's not all very, very serious stuff. Actually, it is an experience, yeah? So when we look at Buddhist concepts, mindfulness can be traced to the Sati tradition, and there is a reference here. If any of you are interested, I can give it to you. It's from the journal Gerontologist. And this mindfulness is especially effective for older people to gain, number one, acceptance of impermanence, that We are all mortal, okay? Accept emotional experiences positively in a non-judgmental way, thus integrating painful and positive experiences. So this acceptance is what mindfulness helps us to move into. Just a little bit more for those of you who may be curious. Some of the literature in the Hindu tradition, the Upanishads, are the first books in the Vedic tradition, and they reveal the truths about existence. And the Upanishads have been translated into English, and they're easier to read than some of the other heavier going books like Bhagavad Gita or Ramayana. The rishis or the saints did not wish to leave their authorship, as the truths belong to the whole universe. Hence, there is no author to Upanishads. Came by word of mouth, right? And it was translated. Each person is a Jiv Atma, like I am a Jiv Atma. That means a small Atma. And the purpose of my life, or Jiv Atma, is to return back to the source, which is the Atma up there. So my purpose one day is when I die, I will hopefully join the Atma or the source. And that brings my life to completion. The understanding of Advaita and oneness is actually quite central to Hindu tradition. In the Punjabi or Hindi language, they say, so and so pura ho gaya. At death, his soul is perceived by the survivors as having been completed and returned to the source. So they don't say so and so has died. They would say so and so has reached completion. You see, because that's what they believe, that at the point of death, the soul goes back to the source and the soul is completed. So the divine purpose of a being existence is to return to the whole. But even while it is away from the whole, it is still part of the whole because it was never separate. So this is again something I have recently started to understand fully, that non-duality is always there. There is no beginning, there is no end, because the oneness continues day after day. Suffering begins when we view ourselves as separate from the cosmos and from others. When this realization occurs, humans feel free and experience inner happiness. So let's look at some empirical research on spiritual pursuits and aging. In the US, the longitudinal study of generations teaches us a few things about intergenerational transmission of religious traditions across ethnic groups. And this was done by Bankston and his team, and in the context of Los Angeles. Now, very interestingly, they found the enduring effect of childhood socialization. That what you teach when children are very young, preferably under 5, it lasts for a very long time, because that's when they can absorb a lot of these teachings. What was the predictor of still following religion in adulthood or old age? Closeness of parent-child relations. They found that was one of the key factors. And they studied 350 families, 3-generational and 4-generational, using mixed method research design. Now, on the eastern side, I've given you one example on the west. And this is the integrative body-mind-spirit model is a body of research started by someone called Cecilia Chan in Hong Kong. I have some friends from Hong Kong, so you must have heard of Cecilia. Yeah. So in her work, she talks about the philosophical underpinnings in Buddhism and Taoism. The Eastern perspective of the mind is applied to relieve stress, and she uses samples like cancer patients, and stimulates spiritual growth and transformation. So this is how we can apply the spiritual path in helping people overcome their crisis or their stress. New coping skills are taught in her Center on Behavioral Science, and intervention has been shown to be successful with female trauma survivors and cancer patients. So what I'm trying to say is there is practical value to applying spiritual techniques and spiritual growth in populations which are vulnerable or which have high levels of stress. There is research on aging and spirituality which has shown that religious involvement and religiosity have been used synonymously with spiritual activities and spirituality. However, in the last 2 to 3 decades, there is a conscious effort, as we have seen in this conference, to separate and understand where is the overlap and where is the difference between religion and spirituality. Religion is seen as more organized, institutionalized, whereas spirituality is seen as more individualistic, existentialist, and internalized. And of course, some examples of spiritual activities. Some of you may be interested to know how we have applied research on aging to coping, and I think I will just quickly touch on this because there is some more that I want to cover. Let's just say that all the research regarding aging process and older persons in many parts of the world has shown, especially Peter Coleman and his team in England and others, have shown that those who are into spirituality or religious involvement in old age, they adjust positively to that stage of their life. Somehow it gives them that strength. We heard about inner strength this morning. There is resilience, and there is like a radar that helps them navigate through the old age challenges. There are scholarly insights into aging and adjustment, and some of this is covered already earlier on trials of practice of spiritual reminiscence intervention with people with mild and moderate dementia, and I'm using some Asian example here, but with the guidance of Prof. McKinley. I think this team did a good job in measuring how people benefit from this spiritual reminiscence in Taiwan. But this term japa, I think chanting is in every religious tradition. Am I right? We all have chanting, whether it's Buddhist, whether it's Muslim, whether it's Christian. What does chanting do? Actually, chanting or japa helps us to focus, right? And we repeat the same term again and again, sometimes not with our mouth, but in our mind we are repeating that term. It really helps us to focus, helps us to calm down, and helps us to be within ourselves. So again, I can say this is universal, yeah? I remember one Muslim man I interviewed for my PhD, and he said something very interesting. He was quite poor, and he lived in a one-room flat, and he said, you know, when I have terrible headache, what helps me most is chanting. He says, I chant, and he was Muslim, so he chants from the Quran, and he said, it helps me relax, and my headache just goes away. So, you know, he didn't have too much money to spend on, you know, ibuprofen or whatever else people take, Panadol and so on. So he says, I save my money. I just chant, I relax, and my headache goes. So this is another function of japa, you know, which he taught me. After post-op, after an operation, I have seen research on how prayer helps to get the person to calm down or to be less anxious. Cultural issues and differences in family contexts are also another area where spiritual practices help in closing the gap between the ideal and the real, between the internal and the external. Now coming to the crux, the search for meaning in life. We have a good start with Butler talking about life review, which is a conscious or unconscious process of re-evaluating one's past, trying to come to terms with it. Then there's the Japanese term called ikigai. Some of you may have come across this. What is one's meaning and purpose in life? And this term ikigai, just one word, whereas in other languages we have to use like 5 or 6 words, right? But here one word summarizes for the Japanese this whole purpose of life. In Hindu tradition as well as Indian tradition, we talk about completion, merging with the source, and that is the meaning of life. When you come to that point, you're liberated and you merge with the source. I came across this book called Graceful Exit. It's a very small book. Any of you heard of it? Graceful Exit. If you haven't, try to read it. It's a very small book, but it's about different ways people have left this earth, and they talk about the Zen teachers, they talk about the Hindu saints, the Buddhist saints. And one thing I remember, they said that if you have reached that point of spiritual growth where you are beyond this body, at the point of death, actually, people saw the body the night before. The next morning, they went to the same place and they saw a flower. The body was no more there. So really, the body merged with the cosmos. Now, isn't that unbelievable? To me, it was like, oh, how do I ever believe this? But really, there's a lot more that we cannot actually believe, but it happens. And this was written by a very scholarly person, and he looked at all the different cultures in Asia. And the last concept is consciousness, the art of knowing oneself. I mentioned this earlier, know thyself. And in the Indian term, they say, I am that. Soham. S-O-H-A-M. Some of you may Google that. Soham, I am that. That means I am part of the divine. I am divine and the divine is me. And once you get that connection, nothing can stop you after that, from being liberated. So in pictorial form, I want to share with you the gerontology perspective. Many of you might be familiar, but just for those who are new to this gerontology perspective, it consists of a multidisciplinary approach, or what we call a holistic approach to aging. Biological, social, psychological, and spiritual. All 4 are included in this approach. So whether it's long-term care, whether it's hospital care, or whether it's family care, I think if we use this combined holistic approach, we can come together with wisdom as well as to inspire people to live their life to the fullest. And I don't have that much time to talk about the gerontology perspective, but ever since I went into this discipline, to me it has been a very fulfilling journey, because now I feel I understand aging so much better, because then we look at the older person as a whole person and not as a body or just a mind or just a spirit, but actually it is the totality of it all that we need to understand. When we care for someone, it's the totality, that human being that we are talking to. So, introducing to you Gerotranscendence, which Lars Tornström started. He's a Swedish person and a gerontologist, and he offered the Gerotranscendence theory to all of us. And this morning, Prof. Elizabeth also mentioned. And so, according to him, Gerotranscendence is universal. As people move from their 50s to their 60s to the 70s to the 80s, they go through this process of becoming more and more spiritually inclined. And he talks about 3 parts to it. One is your relationship to the cosmos. The other is the relationship to yourself. And the third is your relationship to others. So he calls these the 3 dimensions. And I think it summarizes the whole spiritual journey for most of us. Okay? But different people start at different baselines, and our progress depends on our commitment and effort. I really don't want to end by saying that everything is positive in old age. I think that would be like looking at the world through rose-tinted glasses. Not everybody adjusts positively in old age. Some of us have negative adjustment patterns as well. But if we look at Erickson's theory of integrity versus despair, we may conclude that those who are in despair would be frustrated, unhappy, full of regrets, therefore unable to achieve gerotranscendence. But maybe they achieve one of it and not all 3. So there is case A and there is case B. Okay. I'll just give you a few seconds to look at case A and case B, and then I will ask you a question. So one is divorced, cynical, lonely, has certain habits like drinking, smoking, and likes to complain to neighbors and so on. And the case B, 4 chronic illnesses, financially strapped, but cheerful person, struggling with life, mobile, is on government aid, and he's liked by his friends. So the question is, who is more likely to have a better experience of gerotranscendence, case A or case B? How many of you say A? How many of you say B? Yeah. Actually, both have the potential. Yes? Yeah. Both have the potential, but how much effort do they put into this spiritual growth? And how much interest there is would determine. And of course, if you're a social worker or a therapist, you would encourage whichever person would like to go and take that journey with you. So, coming to the end, spiritual growth upon reflection seems that whatever our baseline, all human beings have the capacity to grow spiritually. And the desire to self-realize may be latent, but given certain circumstances, it may sprout suddenly. Or, given the presence of a mentor or guru or teacher, it may find its path to grow. To me, it's not a race, but a journey. We all have to travel spiritually at our own pace, in our own unique pattern. Thank you.